Hi folks, welcome to RJ Impact. Today we're going to be continuing to talk about an extraordinary set of events involving a mother and child relationship that took place over 2 decades, starting in Louisiana and ending in Missouri. This is the second of a two-parter, and in this part we'll reveal how Dee Dee Blanchard was brutally murdered and solve the mystery of the disappearance of the tragically ill child Gypsy Rose Blanchard. In case it's not obvious, if you haven't already, you probably need to listen to part 1 first. So Dee Dee Blanchard has been murdered, and her daughter Gypsy Rose Blanchard has disappeared without her medications or wheelchair. Pretty tragic and concerning for the whole community, obviously. All of what you heard in part 1 is factual. Concrete records exist to support it all. So what do you think might have happened? Try to think of another narrative on top of the facts you've heard about in part 1, and unless you've heard of the case before, the mystery of the suspicious death of Dee Dee and the disappearance of Gypsy has a solution that is about as bizarre as it can get. Well, let's get to Gypsy Rose's disappearance. She was actually found very, very quickly, almost the next day after the murder of her mother Dee Dee had been discovered, much to the relief of everyone concerned. So the worst fears for her safety were allayed. She was found in Wisconsin, a neighbouring state. Police had tracked down a man of interest, as they say, and found both the man and Gypsy at his house. The man had a record for the wrong kind of exposure, if you understand me, and was autistic himself. It seemed to all that a looming second tragedy had been averted. So what really happened? I'm not going to go into all the facts and details of Dee Dee's early life and the early life of Gypsy, but let's relay some of the facts pertinent to what we learnt about in part 1 that were relayed by Gypsy herself and from friends and colleagues and Dee Dee's own family. So relatives recall that Dee Dee had a habit of stealing from her family, and they speculated that this was a form of retaliation when things didn't go her way. At some point in her early life, she worked as a nursing aide, as we know, and according to her family, she'd actually deprived her own mother of food, which may or may not have contributed to her death. Rod, Dee Dee's ex-husband and Gypsy's father, unlike the narrative told by Dee Dee, had in fact kept in touch with Gypsy. The extent to which they kept in touch was unbeknownst to Dee Dee, but they had regularly spoken on the phone, and he had kept up with his $1,200 a month child support payments throughout, also sending gifts like TV sets and Nintendos to her, although it's unclear whether Dee Dee gave them to Gypsy. Rod said to Fox News, "But I was always hoping that Gypsy would get old enough that one day we could bond. It got really hard, it really did, but I didn't want to push it too far. Dee Dee had full custody and could cut me off completely from any kind of relationship we already had. There was a fine line I had to walk with her." The sick child. A fallacy? Well, some of the doctors who had examined Gypsy Rose had found no evidence of the claimed disorders. On being treated for muscular dystrophy, Flasticine, a neurologist, ordered MRIs and blood tests which found no abnormalities. He saw Gypsy stand and told Dee Dee that her daughter could walk. He found out that Gypsy's original doctors in New Orleans had done a biopsy which was also negative, but Dee Dee had told him that all her original records had been destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, which was false. You see, Dee Dee had been making her daughter pass herself off as younger and pretend to be disabled and chronically ill, subjecting her to unnecessary surgery and medication. Because Dee Dee had changed her name and moved after her family who had suspected she'd poisoned her stepmother and confronted her about how she treated Gypsy Rose, these things didn't catch up with her. Dee Dee had sometimes gripped Gypsy's hand with a vice-like grip painfully whilst in public, making Gypsy play along with the whole charade.
I remember my mom had gave me this little glass house, and she said, one day this will be real. And now it finally is.
When they were alone, she'd strike Gypsy if she didn't play along well enough. The cancer? Well, the only connection with someone who has cancer was that Dee Dee shaved Gypsy's head religiously, for appearance's sake, no doubt. Dee Dee had some of Gypsy's saliva glands treated with Botox, then extracted altogether to control her drooling. Now, she'd induced this using a topical anaesthetic to numb Gypsy's gums before doctor visits. The lack of salivary glands, coupled with side effects of the anti-seizure medication she was given, caused Gypsy's already few teeth to decay to the point that the majority of her front teeth were extracted and replaced by a bridge. Tubes were implanted in her ears to control her myriad purported ear infections. The suspicion is that Dee Dee had factitious disorder imposed on another. This is a mental disorder called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, in which a parent or other caretaker exaggerates, fabricates, or induces illness in a person under their care to obtain sympathy or attention. There was apparently one opportunity where there could have been a break in this whole pattern when an anonymous tipster told authorities that Dee Dee's changing names and the dates for Gypsy's birth and Gypsy's actual medical health status were all suspicious. When officers visited Dee Dee, she was able to talk to all this, and with Gypsy appearing to be genuinely mentally challenged, they closed the file. And Gypsy's age? Well, Dee Dee kept lowering this. Obviously, a sick child is a better cash cow than a sick adult, so she falsified paperwork and forged documents to make it appear as official as possible. Gypsy grows up. But Gypsy wasn't mentally challenged, and she wasn't a child. As is common for most children, she was growing up, and she has said that for 14 years she wasn't actually sure of her real age. At the convention we heard about in part 1, Gypsy hadn't been abducted. She'd attempted to escape with the person she was found with in the hotel room. She'd met him online. What his real age was is unclear, but Gypsy was either 19 or 20 at the time. After this, Dee Dee smashed her computer with a hammer and handcuffed her to a bed for about 2 weeks, threatening to smash her fingers if she ever tried to do it again. Despite all this, Gypsy, however, continued to use the internet online long after her mother had gone to bed and met a man online. And then they started an online flirtatious and then a slightly more explicit relationship with each other. Police found out about this when a neighbour, Woodman C., a woman who was probably Gypsy's only friend and had been confided in by Gypsy, had told them that she thought the relationship was suspicious and possibly dangerous for Gypsy. The next year, Gypsy arranged and also paid for the man to meet Dee Dee. The plan was for him just to casually bump into her while she and Dee Dee were at a movie theatre, both of them in costume, and then later for her to introduce him to her mother. But as soon as they did meet in person for the first time, Gypsy led him to the bathroom where the two had relations. The man? This was Nicholas Godejohn. An unhealthy relationship. Let's now relay more detail of the murder that we now know from testimonies from those involved. In June 2015, Godejohn, yes, Gypsy's love interest, visited the Blanchards. He arrived after Dee Dee had gone to sleep, and Gypsy let him into the home and gave him duct tape, gloves and a knife with the understanding that he would use it to murder Dee Dee. She hid in the bathroom and covered her ears so that she would not hear her mother screaming. Godejohn then stabbed Dee Dee 17 times in the back whilst she was asleep. Afterward, the two had relations in Gypsy's room, took $4,000 in cash and fled. Apparently, they mailed the murder weapon back to Godejohn's house in Wisconsin to avoid being caught with it if they were. They then took a bus there, and several witnesses who saw the pair on the way to the Greyhound station noted that Gypsy wore a blonde wig and walked unassisted. Unravelling the deception, Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn were discovered by the police the following day in Wisconsin. What initially appeared to be the abduction of a disabled girl took an unexpected twist when investigators revealed that Gypsy Rose was in fact an adult, free from the physical and mental health issues her mother had claimed. The public's initial outrage transformed into a mix of shock and sympathy for Gypsy Rose as the truth emerged. Back in Springfield, relief swept through the community upon learning that Gypsy was safe. However, Gypsy and Goat John found themselves facing a $1 million bond. Sheriff Jim Arnott cautioned the media, emphasizing that things are not always what they appear. The truth about the Blanchards' lives together began to surface in Springfield, and local media uncovering the startling revelation that Gypsy had never been sick and had always been capable of working, wrote that it turned out her mother had orchestrated an elaborate charade or fraud, prompting a wave of disbelief and a reflection on the true nature of this bizarre case.
And I want to start off with saying things are not always as they appear.
Well, to some extent that's the puzzle solved. I mean, what is the aftermath and what were reactions to the whole affair? Gypsy Rose inevitably had a trial, and sympathy shifted from the initial perception of her as the victim to recognising her as a long-term victim of child abuse by her mother. Despite facing the possibility of the death penalty or life without parole for first-degree murder, the prosecutor offered a plea bargain for Gypsy, which resulted in a 10-year prison sentence. Meanwhile, Nicholas Goat John, charged with initiating the murder plot, faced a more severe outcome. His trial included arguments about his intelligence and autism, but ultimately he was convicted for first-degree murder and armed criminal action, resulting in a life sentence. And what of Gypsy Rose? She said from prison, "I feel like I'm more free in prison than with living with my mum, because now I'm just allowed to live like a normal woman." On June the 27th, 2022, Gypsy married Ryan Scott Anderson. On September the 29th, 2023, the Missouri Department of Corrections confirmed that Gypsy has been granted parole and will be released on December the 28th, 2023, after serving 85% of her sentence per state law. Well, thanks for listening or watching this, and if you did enjoy it, please consider a subscription. It is really appreciated, and as the hand of subscribe presses on the notification bell, that is the button to open the door on a Missouri prison, all that's left for me to say is bye for now.